Oh my gosh, Droven, why are you in a brand new Minecraft world? Well, that would be because I'm currently in my best friend's closet, recording this on a PC that isn't mine. I downloaded my Forever World onto a flash drive that's currently sitting at my house over an hour away. So we're going to take this opportunity as a fresh start on the newest update. We're going to see what it has to offer. Anyways, I found some great stories to read today. Let's go ahead and get right into it. The first story today is from r/no-sleep from user additionalbowl7144. The sea never forgets what we owe it. My grandfather spent his entire life avoiding the sea as if some deep fear lay hidden in his soul. It was something I could never understand. My family's from a traditional fishing village on the coast of Portugal, where for generations men fished those waters in long, high-prowed wooden boats that look like they're cutting the waves as they pushed into the sea. Everyone in the village knew my grandfather as a quiet man, one of those trained by oppressive Estado Novo dictatorship to swallow his words and close the curtains whenever the military police passed by in the street. He died last week. In the middle of his old things, inside one of those old metal biscuit tins, I found a black cover notebook. It was his diary from 1965, the year hunger nearly wiped out the Portuguese coast and when the sea suddenly fell silent. According to the entries from January 1965, the fish, all of a sudden, vanished from the coast without warning. The boats would leave at dawn and return at the end of the day with empty, clean nets, not a single sardine on them. After 3 weeks, hunger began to bring about desperation. My grandfather wrote that the children in the village cried with empty bellies, and the women spent their days in church praying. But on the beach, the atmosphere was cutting, like a knife. The local mayor, terrified that the misery would spawn a revolt, and that news of it would reach the government's ears in the capital, sent the military police and the dreaded PIDE secret state agents to the beach. They controlled the landing. When the fishermen brought the high-prowed boats with empty nets onto the sand, the men in dark raincoats would approach and accuse them of conducting a hidden strike or of concealing the fish to sabotage the regime. The order was clear. They had to go further, into the high seas, where the sea was dangerous and the small boats had no safety. It was on a Tuesday of thick fog that my grandfather and 3 other men decided to risk everything. They ventured kilometers from the coast, far beyond the limit where the water changed tone and became a dark abyss. The fog was so thick they could barely see the prow of their own boat. They released the oars to cast the net, and that's when the silence became too heavy. First, they heard the sound. It wasn't the normal lapping of waves, it was the sound of water being cut abruptly, as if something huge had broken the surface right beside them and submersed again without making a splash. My grandfather clung to the wooden gunwale. He looked down and, through the gray water, saw the shapes. They looked like sharks in size, but moved with a speed no real fish could possess. They passed under the hull, leaving a trail of phosphorescent foam. Wow, guys, I got that word on the first try. Just gonna put that out there. And worst of all, they seemed to be circling the boat, violently scaring off the few schools of fish that remained down there. They returned to land without a single fish in the net, with frozen hands and stomachs that screamed with hunger. On the sand, the PIDE men looked at them with that silent disdain, noting names in a little black notebook. But my grandfather and the others didn't even have the strength to care. That night, in the corner of a dark tavern, far from windows and the eyes of any regime informant, the fishermen finally began to open up. The fear of hunger was being overtaken by a much worse fear. That's when Old Manuel, an old man who had already lost 2 sons to the seas years before, told what happened to him the night before. He had gone out alone, by the light of a kerosene lamp, one of those used for fishing at night. He said the sea was too calm, like a smoky mirror. When he looked over the side of his boat, down there, in the darkness of the water, where the lamp's light died, he saw a reflection. It looked like the shimmering, yellowish glint of a cat's eye reflecting a fireplace's flame, focused directly at him. Old Manuel blinked. thinking it was exhaustion, but when he looked again, the pair of eyes had multiplied. There were dozens of them, motionless, floating just below the waterline, staring at him in the dark. Fish? Not a sight of them. Just those eyes watching, staring him down to his core. The routine became a dragged-out nightmare. Every new attempt to go to sea brought similar reports, and despair spread through the village like fire. That's when the older woman took to the beach. They were the widows, those women the sea had already punished in the past, always dressed in a heavy black that seemed to swallow the daylight. They didn't care about the police or the mayor's warnings. They gathered at the water's edge, on their knees in wet sand, wooden rosaries in their hands, praying and crying for the lost sons and husbands who died at sea. My grandfather wrote that their wails mixed with the sound of the waves in a terrifying way. They said the air no longer smelled of sea spray. It smelled like a cemetery, and they swore that the water was asking for something the village could not give. The following Thursday began gray. My grandfather's boat was about to be pushed into the sea when 3 PIDE agents appeared, their dark raincoats dragging in the damp sand. They came aggressively, shouting that this was a farce, that the fishermen were hiding the fish in clandestine warehouses to create hunger and revolt against the regime. Antonio, one of my grandfather's best friends, a burly man who could no longer bear to see his children starve, confronted them. He told them to their faces that if they wanted fish, they should go to sea and freeze to death themselves. The response was brutal. The agents set upon him right there, in front of everyone, pistol whipping him and kicking his ribs. When they finished beating him, with Antonio already semi-unconscious in the sand, they dragged him and threw him into the boat like a sack of potatoes. One of the PIDE men pointed his gun at my grandfather's head and said if they returned without fish, none of them would go back home alive. The passage to the high seas was a torment. Antonio laid on the floor of the boat, suffering greatly, groaning in pain and spitting blood mixed with vomit because of the blows he had taken to his stomach. My grandfather navigated blindly through the fog that closed over them, again like a shroud. When they reached the deepest point, they stopped rowing. The silence of that desert of water was deafening, broken only by Antonio's weak grunts. Staggering, trying to compose himself, he dragged himself to the edge of the boat and leaned over to try and wash his bloody hands and face in the cold water of the sea. The second his blood touched the water, the world seemed to stop. A sound was heard. It didn't come from far, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A strident, high-pitched scream that seemed to echo from the infinite of sea and rip through the fog itself. My grandfather and the other 3 men covered their ears, dizzy with the vibration of that monstrous lament, trying to understand where it came from, looking in panic at the gray horizon. They took maybe 30 seconds to compose themselves when they finally lowered their hands and looked at the boat's edge. Antonio had disappeared. There was no splash, no cry for help, no sound of a body falling into the water. Nothing. Only absolute silence and a perfectly smooth sea. They began to scream his name in panic, peering into the dark water, but the darkness had swallowed Antonio. It was then that the water began to effervesce. From out of nowhere, without warning, thousands of silver reflections began to struggle around the boat. Huge, gigantic schools, of a density my grandfather had never seen in his entire life, came to the surface. The fish jumped into the boat themselves. In shock, still crying for their friend, but driven by pure survival instinct and the fear of the men waiting for them on land, the fishermen cast the net and made one of the largest hauls remembered on that coast. The boat touched the beach at the end of the afternoon, heavy, nearly sinking with the weight of the net it was pulling. My grandfather and the other 3 men jumped onto the sand with ghostly faces, with empty eyes and exhaustion that came from within their souls. But no one noticed, no one cared. The sight of that absurd quantity of fish washed away everyone's senses. The sea of silver was so great that the oxen and cows they used on the sand to pull the nets locked their legs in the sand, without strength to pull the weight. The population that was on the beach, Men, women, children who hadn't had a decent meal in weeks threw themselves onto the ropes to help pull, in a frenzy that seemed like collective madness. Amidst the chaos of scales and screams of joy, the chief of the PIDE approached my grandfather. He looked at the brimming boat, let out a cynical smile, and gave him 2 slow little pats on the cheek, with that disgusting condescension of one who owns the world. He whispered in his ear that he had made the right decision, that after all, fish does appear when men listen, and turned his back while ordering the other agents to load their van with the best of the haul. For the authorities, the matter was resolved. For the people, a miracle had happened. Amidst that hungry euphoria, no one noticed Antonio's absence. My grandfather and his colleagues let themselves fall onto the wet sand. They sat there, motionless, staring at nothing as the day died and the beach slowly emptied. People passed by them, patted them on the shoulder, thanked them with tears in their eyes for the feast that was going to save the village from misery. But they heard nothing. They were in another world, trapped in that infinite scream they heard in the midst of the fog. They only returned to reality in the last light of the day, when the beach became deserted, leaving only a dark silhouette approaching them. It was Maria, Antonio's wife, with her black shawl pressed against her chest and her eyes red from crying. She looked at the 3, sensed the silence, and asked for her husband. In that hour of twilight, the heavy fog they had left in the high seas began to crawl across the beach, kissing the sand and bringing a salty, cold, and cutting breeze. When Maria questioned my grandfather again, the silence became suffocating. My grandfather rose slowly, unable to look directly in her eyes. He took the salt-stained flat cap from his head, with hands shaking from pure nervousness and panic, rolling the cloth over and over against his callous skin of his hands, suffocated by a dry knot in his throat. He tried to speak, stammered, opened his mouth to try and come up with an excuse or give the news of his friend's death, but the words simply refused to come out. It was exactly at that moment of absolute silence that a voice echoed behind their backs. It was Antonio's voice, clear and firm. He appeared from behind the boat, looking completely healthy, without a single bruise, without blood on his face, as if the PIDE agents had never touched him. He came rolling a thick rope, which he threw inside the boat with a dry thud. My grandfather and the other 3 fishermen were paralyzed, in shock, staring at him as if they were seeing a ghost, while Maria, oblivious to the horror, ran excitedly in tears into her husband's arms. Antonio embraced her with a wide smile. When the 2 began to walk toward the village, Antonio stopped for a second, looked back, and stared at his 3 colleagues, and simply said, "See you next time, lads." At that precise instant, with the last reflection of the sun completely vanishing on the horizon, the light hit his face. Antonio's eyes glowed in the dark with a yellowish reflection, exactly like the cat's eyes old Manuel had seen at the bottom of the sea. The diary ended with a rush note written the next day. My grandfather wrote that he could not spend even one more night on that coast. He gathered his family, put what he could carry in an ox cart, and fled to the interior, to the countryside, vowing that never again in his life he would live near the sea. Years later, the fear of that night still pursued him so much that he ended up immigrating to France, where I ended up being born. My grandfather spent his entire life running from the sea, but now that I've read his diary, I finally understand why he always said that one sentence: "The sea never forgets what we owe it." Man, I don't know about you guys, but these ocean horror stories never fail to freak me out. Anyways, shout out to the author, Additional Bull 7144, and let's get on with the next one. The next story is also from r/nosleep from user ExcellentMaze568. I was rescued after spending 3 months in a cave. I should have stayed there. Carl was dead. He passed in the night, too weak from the cold and hunger to keep fighting. I couldn't blame him. I was about ready to go myself. Cold permeated every molecule of my being. The memory of what warm felt like had long since vacated my mind. Forming thoughts had become as hard as moving my fingers, purple from the frostbite that ate away at them. The only thoughts I still had now were those of hunger. Staring at Carl's corpse, it looked less like my friend and more like another day on this earth. I lay face down on the stone floor, my head cocked towards what was left of Carl. His pale gray skin was flaked with ice crystals, his tongue hanging out of his mouth, purple and bloated. I licked my lips at the thought of biting into it, aching for the feeling of anything in my stomach, anything to fill the void in my abdomen that screamed for food. "Carl," I rasped, my throat igniting into a hellfire at the effort. I waited for an answer, my ears straining against the howl of the wind for sound, any proof of life. I closed my eyes against the hunger. "Ted, you still with me, buddy?" My eyes shot open. I stared at the corpse on the ground before me. His eyes were still glazed over, tongue still jutting from his mouth like a plum ripe for the picking. "Teddy, you did it. You lasted longer than me, old friend." His voice was as it had been when the blizzard hit. He still had the SoCal accent with that nasally note snow always gave him. When was the last time I heard that voice? It had been a couple of days, or was it weeks? "Carl?" I croaked again, the strain almost too much to handle. "That's right, Ted. Your good buddy Carl in the flesh." I blinked. His lips weren't moving, but that was Carl's voice. "You won, Teddy. You remember our deal? Winner gets to eat the other person. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Right, dude?" As a matter of fact, I couldn't remember the deal. I couldn't remember much of anything since we crawled into the cave. My stomach had resorted to eating memories, anything to keep going. I attempted to respond, but my throat failed me, only managing a guttural moan. "That's the spirit. Looks like the Tedster's still kicking. Look, I don't want you to die too, buddy. No reason for both of us to go, right?" Carl had a point. He was always the smart one. He had booked the ski tickets at a steal after all. And why should we both die? God couldn't be that cruel, right? Taking out two friends who went out for a little fun in the snow? No. Now you're cooking, Teddy. Don't just let me go to waste. I wouldn't do that to you. My fingers tensed on their own, twisting into claws against the stone. My arms pulled. The sound of my jacket scraping the stone and ice filled my ears as I flinched towards Carl. My sense of touch long since killed by the cold. "That's it, Teddy. You're nearly there." My legs followed behind me limply as I drew nearer, closer to Carl, closer to food. The smell of death began to permeate the air. It was intoxicating, better than any Thanksgiving dinner. Every pull towards his corpse gave me renewed energy. Carl really was a good friend. My fingers hooked into Carl's jacket. With one last heave, I pulled myself on top of him, my face pressed into the icy surface of his cheek. "Way to go, Tedster. Hard part's over. Claim your prize." I licked my lips in anticipation, slowly forcing my jaw open, my frozen muscles popping and straining from underuse, lowering my teeth down until they touched the pale flesh of his emaciated jaw muscle. "Nice, Teddy. Just a little bite." My jaw closed slowly, like a hydraulic press. My teeth pressed into his skin, meeting resistance as the pressure started to grow. The flesh gave like biting into frozen ice cream. My eyes rolled back into my head from the pleasure of eating. I had taken eating for granted. It was no longer a task that had little meaning. I would treasure eating forever, all thanks to Carl. My jaw slowly closed around the hunk of flesh. I chewed once, twice, then swallowed. A low growl of pleasure escaped my lips as I felt the flesh slide down into my stomach. "That's a boy, Teddy. Don't stop now. Food's getting cold." I started biting and chewing with new ferocity. It was a blur of motion the cave had not seen since the first day we entered. Primal hunger took over as I devoured Carl, as I ate the last gift he had ever given me. I ate Carl over the next few days, stripping his clothes and layering them on myself. I didn't shiver as much anymore. First was all of the flesh. Face, arms, legs, torso, even his butt. Then the soft organs. His heart was sweeter than anything I've ever eaten. It makes sense. Carl was a nice guy. By the time I had eaten his trachea, I could stand and walk freely around the cave. "Look at you go, Teddy. Looking just like Schwarzenegger now." Carl's voice echoed through the cave. The last thing to eat was Carl's brain. I held the rock in my hand, the sharp edges digging into my palms. Waste not, want not, Tedster. I wasn't going to waste any of Carl. The rock echoed off his skull with a dull crunch. I brought it down again and again until I couldn't take it anymore and began tearing his skull apart with my bare hands. The rock left covered in blood on the cave floor. As I wiped my mouth and sat back, I looked out of the cave's mouth. The snow had stopped. How long ago had it ended? How long was I eating Carl? I walked out into the gray afternoon, the sun already starting to dip towards the horizon. Stumbling, I followed it. I walked all night. Night turned to day, then back to night. I walked, knowing if I stopped, I wouldn't get back up. The landscape around me was dead and infinite. All of the trees looked the same, their gnarled branches protruding like bony fingers down towards me. I walked until my legs gave out, face planting in the snow. My eyes got heavy as I lay there, my vision reduced to a pinhole as I drifted off to sleep. When I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the lack of cold. Warmth? A rhythmic beeping filled the air as I willed my eyes to show me where I was. No matter how hard I tried, how many times I blinked, I could only see white. I groaned, earning a shocked gasp off to my right. I spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital. I had been missing 3 months when the park rangers found me. Frostbite had destroyed my fingers, toes, and other patches of skin. My walk through the woods gave me snow blindness, which explained the gauze wrapped over my eyes when I awoke. Worst of all, I had lost almost 80 pounds, but thanks to Carl, I was alive. I was hooked to a feeding tube for those 2 weeks while I recovered. Doctors said I wouldn't be able to process solid food for a while after my stomach had gone so long without it, but I knew that was a lie. When they released me at the end of the 2 weeks, I was a new man. The cops asked me questions about what happened. Where had I gone? How did I survive? Where was Carl? I didn't answer, unable to remember anything but the taste of Carl's flesh. That was something I would never forget, and something these people wouldn't understand. Carl had given me a gift, and I wouldn't waste it locked in a cell. They let me go, and I boarded a plane back to California. The first thing I did when I got home was stop at my favorite burger joint. I sat in my car holding the biggest burger they had on the menu. Real food. I took a big bite and paused. It didn't have any flavor. I swallowed the hunk of meat, disappointed. Maybe my taste buds hadn't come back yet? I ate the burger slowly, sitting in silence. As I took the last bite, I threw my car door open and vomited all of it back up onto the pavement. Maybe the doctor was right. I wasn't ready for solid food yet. I returned to my apartment, getting lost a few times along the way. Sticking the key in the lock and giving it a turn, I saw her. She was more beautiful than I remembered. Ted? Her hand shot up, covering her mouth, as tears flowed over her cheeks. Hey, Jess, I said hoarsely, tears welling up in my eyes. She ran over, wrapping me in a hug, tight enough to split a boulder. Her words came flowing out like music to my ears. I had made it home. Thanks, Carl. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy. I was fired from my job. Not that I had a desire to work right now anyway. Jess put me on a liquid diet following the doctor's orders. The shakes and broths had no flavor and left me hungry no matter how full my stomach felt. That was fine for the first week, but the longer I was home, the more frustrated I had become not being able to eat real food. The only difference in my life was the dreams. I had 2 recurring dreams that filled my mind at night. The first, my teeth sinking into Carl's flesh. Except in the dream, he was sitting up, his dead eyes staring into mine while his mouth contorted into a wide smile. His teeth just a little too sharp, his skin pulled a little too tight. That's right, Teddy, gotta get your strength back, buddy, he would coo as my teeth ripped and pulled skin and muscle off his bones. The second dream was something I couldn't remember seeing. I was walking through the woods completely nude. Snow and wind whipped past me, but I couldn't feel the cold. I could hear Carl's voice through the dead woods, beckoning me closer. "Here, Tedster, I'm just over here." I was trudging through the snow after him. His voice was different, the accent gone, replaced by a malice I've never heard any voice utter. The voice never got any closer, no matter how far I walked. I would call out for him in the same voice I had in the cave, a hoarse croak that echoed off the trees. I awoke with a start one night. How long had I been home again? Time was losing its meaning. It's strange how meals help mark the passage of time. I reached over, placing a hand on Jess. Her soft, warm skin was a comfort. My stomach growled loudly as I traced the curvature of her arm. Maybe I could eat real food again. It couldn't hurt, could it? I padded softly to the kitchen, making myself a sandwich, sitting down at the kitchen table with only the fridge light illuminating me. I took a bite. Nothing. No taste to speak of. Swallowing, I devoured the sandwich, savoring the feeling of food going down my throat. "How's the sandwich, Teddy?" I froze, looking around the dark kitchen, searching for the source, searching for Carl. I stood up from the table. An intense nausea flooded my whole body. Running to the guest bathroom, I barely had time to raise the toilet seat before a spew of greasy black bile erupted from my mouth. Yeah, I was never much of a turkey guy myself. Carl's voice echoed inside the small room. I heaved until my stomach was empty again. The hunger gnawed at my stomach like a rabid dog. Flushing the toilet, I sat on the floor and cried, my back against the wall as I pulled my knees to my chest. "Aw, cheer up, Teddy. At least you got to have it for a little while." I looked around again. Alone in the dark, the cold linoleum pressed into my backside. "Carl, where are you?" I asked quietly. "Where do you think, buddy? I couldn't just let you leave me in the cave, you know." I stood up slowly, backing myself into the corner. "No, you're dead. I ate you. You let me live." His chuckle filled my ears. My skin went cold, goosebumps covering my arms. Did Carl chuckle? He always had that stupid laugh that would bring out a smile even on the worst days, but a chuckle? Unnerved, I went back to bed. That was the first time Carl talked to me, but not the last. The next few weeks were hell. I was starving. Jess left to go to a conference in LA for work, leaving me all alone. Surrounded by food I couldn't eat without throwing up unless it went through a blender first. The gray sludge in the blender had no taste. It had no substance. No matter how much I drank, I never felt full. I sat crying in the kitchen floor with the fridge door left wide open. The shelves were bare as I had blended every morsel of food and consumed it. Egg, ham, lettuce, cheese, even raw hamburger meat jammed into the blender and blended to a puree. It didn't even scratch the hunger within me. "Whoa, eating for two, buddy?" Carl's voice taunted from everywhere. "Please make it stop." I sobbed into the empty house. "Oh, I can't make it stop, Teddy. You made your choice. You have to live with it." His voice was different, sharper, cruel and cold despite his teasing words. I hardly noticed, the growl of my stomach louder than the concern in my head. I crawled over the floor towards the trash can, knocking it to the floor and spilling its contents. In a frenzy, I began devouring whatever scraps of food that were left in the bag. How the mighty have fallen, Ted. I didn't care what Carl had to say, shoveling scraps of whatever seemed edible into my mouth. It had no taste. The familiar feeling of nausea hit me. I ran to the bathroom, standing over the sink as a black bile projected out of my mouth. I cried, panting as I fought for breath. Looking up in the mirror, I froze. I watched in horror as a piece of intestine quickly retracted from my open mouth back down my throat. I blinked. My mind must be breaking. The starvation making me see things. I stared into the mirror. My shirt moved just a fraction, like a wrinkle releasing from the fabric. I tore it over my head, staring at my stomach. Watching in horror, the intestine snaked its way around my bloated stomach. I couldn't let you leave me in that cave, Teddy. I was frozen. The only thought filling my head was the starvation that racked my body. My eyes fell on my reflection. The eyes in the mirror were not my own. Sunken into my skull, ringed with black bags from exhaustion, my hair had thinned. stringy patches where a full head of brown hair had once grown, the intestine coiling around my abdomen. You need to eat, Teddy. You know what you have to eat. The intestine continued to coil. I could feel it sliding around my stomach, stoking the flame of my hunger. I heard the key sliding into the lock of the front door. It's supper time, Ted. The words echoing within my very skull. It was no longer Carl's voice. I heard the door open, Jess calling out that she was home. How long had she been gone? My stomach growled audibly in response. Remember our deal, Teddy. I heard Jess gasp as she entered the kitchen, its disarray startling her. Ted, are you here? She called shakily. My fingers tensed on their own, contorting into claws. Food's getting cold, the voice whispered within my soul. I wish I could say I fought it, that I snapped out of it and got help. I wish I could say I did the right thing, but I didn't. I sit in the kitchen typing this out. By the time you find this post and the crushed bones of the woman I love, I'll be on a plane back to North Dakota. The hunger is gone for now, but it'll be back. I can feel it moving within my stomach now. I won't let it win. I'm going back to the cave, secluded from anyone else who I could hurt. Back to Carl. Back to where this thing came from. I'm sorry for the mess. Yeah, that was wild. Definitely a good one to end it on. So he's not a vampire. I'm just going to chalk it up to he was in that cave a little bit too long, and he has an immeasurable amount of guilt on his shoulders from, eating his best friend. And it drove him crazy. So I guess that's the most rational explanation. Anyways, that's all the scary Reddit stories in Minecraft I have for you today. If you liked today's video, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe, as it does help me out greatly. And huge shout out to my channel members. Thank you so much for your support on the channel. If you guys do want to further support the channel, that link is going to be in the description. However, it is not at all required, completely optional. And with all that said, I will see you guys tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Peace.